now we will start the first session of today's webinar entitled The Design of Online Environment for Teaching and Learning During and After COVID-19. Our honorable speaker in this session is Mr. Galvin L. Ngo, M.Ed, from Ateneo de Manila University, Philippines. Mr. Galvin has a BA in Communications Technology Management and MA in Educational Administration. He is an instructor at the Education Department and Communications Department at Ateneo de Manila University. He is the Assistant Director and Coordinator for Innovation and Education Technology at Ateneo de Manila Institute for the Science and Art of Learning and Teaching, or SALT. He is also the CEO of Google Learning Lab and the Learning Designer CMO Innotech. And he is also the EPA Professional Learning Consultant, the Education Technology Specialist in BEST Program, and he was the facilitator of Media and Technology Application, the Whole Person Education Academy 2017 and 2018. His interests are in professional development, creativity, visual thinking, design thinking, adult learning, technology integration, distance and blended learning pedagogy. Now, please welcome Mr. Galvin Ngo. Mr. Galvin, time is yours.
Thank you, Debbie. Allow me just to share my screen before anything else. So I just want to make sure that everyone sees my screen. So if your video is on, maybe give me some signal. If you can hear me and you can see my screen. Yes, great. Thank you. So let me just begin. First of all, good morning to everyone. I'd like to begin with a greeting. I hope I say this right. Selamat pagi for those of you from Indonesia. Magandang umaga if there are some participants from the Philippines, and good morning to everyone else who understands English. So I'll tell you about why I started with the greeting today, which I will reveal at the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to greet everyone first. So first of all, thank you for this opportunity. Maybe before I start my presentation, I just want to say that much like maybe a lot of the universities here, Ateneo de Manila was also caught by surprise by the pandemic, like everyone else, right? And so I guess what I want to say is that what I will do this morning is to share with you the principles that we've been following, how we've been following them so far. But maybe the caveat is they're not perfect. Hopefully today you take them as material for you to reflect on your own context as well. No? So they're not absolute things, they're not biblical in nature, but I hope that they'll be helpful in helping you in your institutions. I'd like to begin with a question, which I think is an important question to think about. At the moment, how would you describe your current situation as an educator or in education? I know that a while ago we talked about the context of the pandemic and how this has really affected our work terribly, you know, in many ways. So I'd like you to think about how you currently feel about this situation, or what best describes this. No? So I'll give you maybe just 5 to 10 seconds to think of an answer. And then if you don't mind, can you go over chat and just type out a word or two about your answer here. No? So how will you describe our current situation in education based on the context that we're in right now, that we're in a pandemic, that a lot of things are uncertain. So sige, I'll give you a few seconds just to post something over chat, and then I'll also look at the chat so that I can see some of your responses. Okay. All right, so I think that people are shy. So if you find yourself answering the question later, just post it over chat. But I think the more important thing is for you to think about this question. Thank you, Alviani, for answering. So sad, yes. Challenging, yes, very much challenging. Forced to look at new ways of teaching. Tiring, yes. I'm teaching a class right now, and I can very much empathize with you. So we'll keep our answers at the back of our heads in this presentation. But what I want to do, sorry, let me just share my screen again. But what I want to do is just to introduce to you a term that we feel really encompasses all of our feelings today. And this term is probably not new to you, most especially in education. We've been talking about this a lot in the past few years. That when we look at our world today, one way to describe it is that it's a VUCA world. It's a world filled with VUCA, volatility, complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity. And I think that more than ever, as we face the pandemic, this is really something that is very real to us. This is something that's very real to us. That, for example, in the Philippines, we get announcements about whether we'll be remaining on quarantine every 2 weeks, right? So imagine planning out your life in as an educator or in your classes or in your institution, given these many different things that you'll need to consider. No? So I think this is a good way to describe our common context, that wherever you are, I think in the world right now, it's safe that you're experiencing this volatility, the complexity of the things that we're encountering, the uncertainty of the future, and the ambiguity, and how confusing all of these things can become for us educators, which I think affects how we feel, which affects why we feel challenged, why we feel anxious, why we feel stressed and tired. No? So much like a lot of you, a lot of us felt this way in Ateneo. And one of the problems that we identified early on is this quote over here: "We are building the bridge as we get there." That ideally, if you use the bridge as an analogy, ideally you build a bridge so that people can pass from one place to another, right? But then no one really knew that this pandemic will happen. So we weren't able to really build bridges to be ready for this. And I think that a lot of institutions can probably relate to this experience. And so we have to begin to build the bridge as we actually cross the bridge, right? And I think that's the tricky part in our situation today, that we're all trying things out. Nobody has the absolute right answers, because a lot of us have been shoved into this particular context or situation. So in Ateneo de Manila, when we looked at what we are supposed to do, or what we at the options in terms of addressing this context, I think this picture summarizes how we initially felt. Like Lego bricks, the many different parts. If you go online, there's a webinar almost every day. There are articles being passed around, research about online learning. There's just so much information that you're not so sure what to follow sometimes. You're not so sure what to actually do. And to be honest, despite the influx of information and sharing, it can be a very paralyzing experience. So for us in Ateneo, we decided to start by articulating what we hope for when we talk about online learning. In Ateneo, we call it the Ateneo Blue Cloud. Our school color is blue, and cloud is just as a symbolism of being on the cloud or being online. And the Ateneo Blue Cloud is really our shared language, philosophy, and framework. So it's a way for us to sort of have a common language when we're talking about what we hope for when we talk about online learning, among faculty, with students, and even with parents. So today, this morning, thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to share with you the framework that we're currently using in the Ateneo de Manila University in Manila. It's called Adaptive Design for Learning. This is our way of articulating how we hope to address what learning can continue to be, despite the context that we're in right now, and even beyond COVID, which is, I think, part of the theme of the webinars. So why adaptive? If you haven't heard of the word adaptive before, we actually copy this from a term that is used in web design. So I don't know if you've heard of this term before, but the term adaptive in web design actually pertains to the phenomenon wherein a website actually changes form depending on the device that you're using. No? So for example, if you're using a laptop, usually a website is bigger. When you're using a phone, a smaller screen, the website becomes smaller and accommodates to your screen. No? So we thought that this is a good analogy of what we're hoping for. How might we design learning experience that will accommodate these changes? Again, going back to the context that we began our discussion with, the VUCA world, no? That if we accept that things will just continue to change, things will continue to be volatile, uncertain, a lot of changes will happen, a lot of ambiguous things that we'll need to face. How do we adapt? No? What is a good way of adapting? So at the Ateneo Salt Institute and in the university, in the past 3 months, we've been talking about 5 principles. So we articulated 5 principles to really spell out what we think adaptive design for learning can be. Again, this is based on our context, so you might find this different from your context, and that's okay, no? But I hope there might be some things here that will also resonate with you. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is just to walk you through the 5 principles: adaptability, modularity, asynchronous and synchronous learning, the 3 C's of online learning, and active and interactive learning. When we piece these things together, this really paints a picture of how we want online learning to be in Ateneo and how we're trying for it to be. I say we're trying it for it to be because we've already tried to run some courses over the past 6 weeks, our first set of courses, and then we're about to start our first semester. So we started to experiment in actually applying these principles in classes, and hopefully some of my sharing will help you also predict what might happen in your courses if you're not starting yet. So for every principle, I will share with you the design question that we have in mind, and then I'll share with you some examples just so you have an idea as to what we're thinking about. So the first principle is adaptability. And the design question here is, how does your design accommodate the different contexts of students? In Ateneo de Manila, we've clearly decided that online learning is our main modality. But we also know that not all students will be able to participate online, at least participate in the same level, not necessarily because of their own personal capacity as learners, but sometimes because of some external factors like internet connectivity, um, no internet connectivity for some, working conditions and learning conditions at home, and all of those particular contexts. So the question in principle number 1 of adaptability is, what are things that we need to think about so that when we design, we accommodate all of these particular things, or we consider those particular things. So this is how we approached it. What we said was, when we design for online learning, we can begin with a basic design. What do we mean by a basic design? One of the things that we realized over the past few months is that, and I know that seems obvious, but for universities like us who may be just starting to go into fully online learning, this is pretty new, and this sort of surprised us in the beginning, that it really takes some time to really build a good online course. And so we realized that since it takes time to build a good online course, it's actually best to collaborate among the faculty to do it. So in the past 3 months, our faculty has been part of an online course that we actually created about adaptive design for learning. And one of their tasks is actually to work with other faculty from their department to actually come together and create a course together. And I'm not so sure what the culture is in your university, but to be honest, this is not necessarily a default culture or something that we're used to doing. What we're used to is individual faculty members will create their syllabus, will run their courses, and everyone really just goes in their own way. Of course, there's a set curriculum, but then it's very rare that faculty will actually co-design a course. So this is something that's new that we tried out, that faculty who teach the same course will help build the course together. And the advantage of this is really quite practical, that we can assign particular topics to different faculty, and everyone can contribute to the building of the course. So we call this the basic design, that maybe faculty can work together in creating a design for the course. But then to make courses adaptable, what we realized is that this basic design should also be supported by low bandwidth versions of either the whole course or some activities. And I'll give some examples later. And maybe we should also make provisions for providing learning packages. So in Ateneo, when we talk about learning packages, we're not talking about printed packages at the moment, unless that's explicitly requested by the student. But what we're talking about are thumb drives, basically, wherein we put all of the course content in the thumb drives, and then we actually send that to students. No? So I'll give you some examples of some practices that we've tried that really articulate or spell out what we mean by the second and the last layer over here. So for example, if you're showing a video in your course, one particular practice that we're endorsing is for teachers to have transcripts, no? So that there's a low bandwidth version, so that students who might have slow internet can choose to actually download the transcript and read that as an alternative to actually watching a video. And this is another example of the thumb drive. No? So this is from Twitter. The student that actually received this posted a tweet about it. This is one of the students that actually requested for the thumb drive version of the whole course. So as you can see on your screen, it's literally a USB drive, and then inside the drive are all of the transcripts, readings, slides, and all of the materials of the course. Of course, the student still needs to coordinate with the instructor, the professor, for the assessments, but this at least gives the student access to the course content. No? So we found this quite helpful for the few students who've actually requested for this. So just to paint a clearer picture of adaptability, so we have the basic design, we have low bandwidth versions, we have learning packages, and then the last and I think important layer is the topmost layer, which we call the contextualized layer. As I mentioned a while ago, most of the basic design will probably be done collaboratively. But then we realize, and I think this is important, most especially from a whole person education perspective, we realize that the voice of the instructor is still very important. No? So even if, let's say, we all co-design a course, we're still giving each other leeway to actually contextualize the content with our own voice. No? So the screen that you're looking at right now actually comes from my personal course. One of the things that I like doing as an instructor is to give examples related to my son. So the picture that you see here is of my 3-year-old son, Asher. And I still continue to do it, no? And maybe my co-teachers do not do it in their courses, but then so that my students can still hear my teacher's voice, I continue to do things that I would often do even in a face-to-face lecture scenario. So that's the invitation, I think, in the topmost layer. Another invitation in the topmost layer is to continue to do things that you feel are important as a teacher in your face-to-face instruction as well. For example, I always start my sessions with a prayer. So even in my modules, I try to include prayers. No? So the screenshot that you see here is an examen that I have my students do in the beginning of one of the modules. So I ask them to literally just pause for around 12 minutes, as you can see on your screen, just to do this guided prayer, and then before they start the module. So I know it looks a little awkward because when we think of modules, we often think of academics, but I think this strikes a balance, and this creates that more whole person education flavor where spirituality is still important as part of the whole learning process. And I just want to share this with you, not to boast about it, but this is one of the feedback I got from students, which I feel really made me affirm that what we're trying to do actually is working, or at least is beneficial for them. I like how the student said here, I have never really felt that the absence of the teacher in this module. No? And I think that's one of the things that we often try to make an effort in, that even if they're learning online, they don't feel like they're learning from a black box. No? We want them to feel like they're still learning from the teacher behind that black box, the teacher who actually designed the course or who is interacting with them. Another invitation in the adaptability is actually to make adjustments within the course. No? And I think this is important, most especially for a lot of us here who have expertise in a particular content area, and we're teaching about this expertise. And the challenge there is usually it's hard to let go. It's hard to let go of things that you don't want students to learn because you feel like everything is important. And I think that's coming from a perspective of expertise, because you know all of these things and you feel like your students should know all of them as well. But then when students actually engage in the course, for example, here, this is the schedule of my actual course now. I had to make adjustments. I realized that my students cannot actually finish my 5 modules. So in the middle of the semester, I had to cut one module out entirely. Of course, I needed to make adjustments in terms of the assessment, among others. But cutting out one whole module, even if that was a very difficult decision for me, really benefited the students because it allowed them the space to actually finish the modules, not to rush through them, to really find time to actually learn through the modules rather than just making sure they finish all of them. No? So when we talk about adaptability, it's about both two things. No? It's about adaptability in design, making things adaptable, making sure that you consider all of these things, and also adaptability in delivery, that when you actually quote unquote meet your students in an online scenario, you're open to making some adjustments and to contextualize the course to them. So the second principle builds on the first one. This is on modularity. The question that we ask here is, how might we design bite-sized content? No? So I think bite-sized content is important right now because when you think about our learners today, and sometimes even us, right? a lot of conversations. I'm sure you've been part of a lot of conversations about how the attention span is now shorter and shorter and shorter. No? And most especially in an asynchronous learning scenario, you're banking on a student's self-management. No? So one way to make sure that you don't overload them is to design things in bite-sized content. But the second thing in bold here is quite important, that when you design bite-sized content, there are opportunities for feedback. No? So what does modularity look like? So the concept of modularity is really a shift from a whole course design to designing in modules, or a shift away from the teach now, test later perspective. No? What do I mean by this? Even as an instructor myself, I usually do the whole course design, meaning I design my whole course as a semester, for example, and then usually all of my assessments are at the end. That's why teach now, test later. But what I realized when we had to shift to the quarantine mode is that uh, when that happened to us abruptly last semester, all of my major assignments were not done, and we had to just cancel it. No? And so, foreseeing these changes, I think, is quite important. And one of the reasons why those changes were hard for us to do is because we were thinking in a whole course design. So, what does it mean to do modular design? When we talk about modular design, what we're thinking of is to design courses by breaking them down into discrete, meaningful chunks, modules, and to have checkpoints in every module, so that it's very clear to you that even if, let's say, after module one, you have to shift to a blended learning mode, it's quite easy to move around things because you've been able to group your course into subgroups of modules already. What does it look like? If we describe it, this is what it looks like, that modules are often framed by competences. These are often your learning outcomes, and evidences of learning or assessments. No? And I'd like to emphasize evidences of learning because we strongly believe that most especially in online learning, learners should be presumed innocent of learning until they are proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. No? That even if they are going through the modules, there's nothing assuring us that they're actually learning. So we have to begin to shift from an attendance mindset to an assessment mindset, that we use assessment as a proof of learning, rather than attendance. Some of us might be thinking, how will I check if students are actually going through the pages of my modules or reading the things that I ask them to read? Those are important questions, but I think the more important question is, how will you make sure that they're actually learning, right? And even if you're not able to answer the first question about attendance or about going through the modules, if you can see that learning is happening, I think that's okay. I think that should be okay. So what does it look like in an actual course? This is again from my course as an example. So we articulate our learning outcomes. I think in a lot of syllabi, this is how it looks like. And then one of the things that we did in our syllabus was to revise it so that we can also reflect how the modules align to the particular learning outcomes. And students can see this so that it's very clear to them that when they're taking module one, the goal is always towards course learning outcome number 2, 4, 1, so on and so forth. And we also did the same with talking about our assessments, to make sure that our assessments are also aligned to our learning outcomes. And again, although this may not be exclusive to online learning, this is very helpful in an online learning scenario because it creates more transparency between the teacher and the student. No? So it's very clear to them what the outcomes are and how what we're asking them to do actually leads to the outcomes that you have set for them. No? So the next principle is asynchronous and synchronous. No? So, and I know that these terms are probably not new to everyone here, that when we talk about online learning, it's really about designing or choosing from asynchronous and synchronous activities. And the driving question here really is, how do we intentionally design what goes to the asynchronous and what goes to the synchronous activities? And I'd like to emphasize here intentionally design, because I think that as we shift to online learning, there could be a tendency just to translate. No? For example, in face-to-face where we lecture. So sometimes we think that since we lecture in face-to-face, that should be done synchronously, just because it's done in face-to-face. So there is a tendency sometimes to think that face-to-face and synchronous are the same. So we need to sort of nuance our understanding of that. So these are some examples of asynchronous and synchronous activities that often happen in a course. Individual readings, watching, listening, online discussion, assignments. These are asynchronous activities in a module. And you, of course, you have live chats, video conferences like this as synchronous activities. What has guided us is really research. That what we found in research about synchronous and asynchronous activities is this, that asynchronous activities are actually better for cognitive types of activities. If you want students to actually digest particular information, conceptualize things, absorb new kinds of concepts to them, because that really takes a lot of reflection and time. So that's usually better allocated to asynchronous activities. While synchronous learning is actually a better scenario or a better learning environment for personal participation, right? Motivating students, creating relationships with them, brainstorming with them, planning with them. And so when we design our courses, we also try to keep this in mind, that we actually favor asynchronous learning in Ateneo, mainly because of equity, so that students who have lower bandwidth will be able to catch up, will be able to do it at their own pace. But apart from that, also pedagogically, because we know that in terms of understanding new content, asynchronous learning experiences are favored. No? So this is a sample schedule of my class wherein they're mostly asynchronous, as you can see, but I do have 3 synchronous sessions within a course of around 6 weeks. So this particular class ran for 6 weeks. We also make sure that we articulate the learning time so that students know what to expect. So this is an example of the agenda of some of my synchronous sessions. I usually have some getting to know you activities. I don't go straight into content, again, because I know that students also miss that personal interaction, and I'm sure that you also miss it. I personally miss it as a teacher as well. So if you want to get to know our students, the synchronous sessions really are great ways to get to know them, most especially if they can afford to show their camera, you can see their face, you can interact with them, and you could also create interactions among them, no? Which can be done asynchronously and synchronously as well. So what are things that we consider when we judge asynchronous and synchronous? We usually look at 3 things: learner's access, learner autonomy. To what extent can you leave them on their own? For example, how we might treat a graduate class might be different from an undergraduate class, and the task that you hope for learners to do. So down to my last 2 principles. The second to the last principle is active and interactive learning. And the driving question here is, how do we design engaging and empowering learning activities, not just content? No? And I think this is important because when we think about online learning, sometimes this is what happens. No? Sometimes we run into the danger of dumping content. I have 10 readings. I will post them all in my learning management system, and I will have students just read all of these things, and I'll give them a quiz. I'll ask them to watch 5 YouTube videos or 10 YouTube videos, and then I'll give them a quiz after. Um, I think we know that that's not necessarily teaching. The teaching is really being able to facilitate this learning experience, not just dumping content on them. So this principle is a reminder to design explicitly and generate an experience, not just to dump content, for students to actively participate, not just to receive content. No? So some of the keywords that we use are things like, we want students to investigate, to create, to collaborate, to contemplate, to reflect, and to communicate their learning. No? How have we been trying to do this? Online discussion forums is a basic tool that we've been using, so that we can engage with students. And this has been effective in terms of getting them to reflect on the content that we present in the learning management system. We've also tried to use some tools like Edpuzzle. So Edpuzzle is a video annotation software tool wherein you can insert a video and then the video will pause so that you can ask questions in between. No? So it becomes a more active and interactive learning experience for students. If you're assigning them reading assignments, we've found this particular tool helpful. It's called Perusal. Perusal allows you to upload a PDF document and to have discussions on the side about parts of the document. So for example, you can highlight parts of the document and ask students questions about different parts of the document. So it can become a more engaging experience for students, despite the fact that it's simply a reading assignment. So the intention, I think, of active and interactive learning in a way is really to slow down the teaching for better learning. For example, the screenshot that you see here is from one of my modules. As you can see, I have a lot of activities. To be honest, I could have just done a 30-minute lecture about all of these things. But instead, I opted to come up with a set of activities so that students will really get things bite size, will really have time to process things, not just to skim, not just to make sure they watch the video, but to really make sure that it gets them to learn, gets them to absorb the information and reflect on the information and content that I'm presenting. So it's really a shift in thinking of what the students will do, not just what the teacher is doing. I know that a lot of us can sometimes feel obsessed about how we present ourselves to students, even in an online format. I've seen a lot of teachers who've bought ring lights, set up their space so that when they take videos of themselves, it's nice. I think that's important and that's helpful. But then hopefully we move beyond that. And I think that's what this principle reminded us of, that hopefully we think of the learning experience. So not just content creation, but designing active and interactive learning experience for our students. Uh, Now, the last principle is called the 3 C's of online learning. And this is where we say we hope that good online learning strikes a balance between 3 things: content, coach, and community. Content is basically about the learning materials and learning activities that you have students engage with in your course. But then, more importantly, we talk about coach, which is your instructor presence, how present you are inside the course, and community, the importance of involving other classmates and collaboration as part of your learning experience. One way of looking at it is to compare the 3 C's or an online learning situation with the 3 C's with remote teaching and remote self-study. Remote teaching are occasions wherein we just do purely synchronous sessions and then we just teach our students. So it's always about you, the teacher, and the content. There's nothing wrong with that, but we feel in Ateneo that that's an incomplete picture of what's possible in online learning. On the other hand, there are situations wherein we ask students to do just purely remote self-study, right? These are 10 activities, do it on your own and learn on your own. And as if you use the 3 C's as a language, this is very much just focus on content. There's a mere absence of coach and community. So what we're hoping for is to strike a balance, that this is one of the guiding principles we have in online learning, that whatever it is that we plan and actually facilitate for students, hopefully there's a good balance between content, well-designed content, the presence of a teacher, a coach, and opportunities to work and collaborate with each other in a learning community, which is often their particular class. So here are some examples just to concretize this particular principle. Replying to discussion forums is a basic way of making the coach available. I know this can be tiring, so sometimes you don't actually need to reply to each one. A strategy that we tried out is called weekly digest. No? So for example, I have 23 students. Everyone answers the discussion forum at a different time. No? So it's impossible to just wait and wait for them to answer. It's not as if that's the only thing I do. So what I often do instead is, sometimes if I can't answer to everyone, I make sure I read everyone's entries and then I send a weekly digest to everyone. No? So in the weekly digest, I take this as an opportunity to clarify misconceptions, to point out some key ideas that have emerged in the discussion, so that the students will feel like you're listening, and at the same time, the presence of the instructor to clarify misconceptions, to help them understand better, to help them fine-tune their understanding is still felt, despite the fact that you're not able to give a 1:1 reply. So we found this quite helpful. Consultation hours is something that we mandate among our teachers, our faculty, that we have to provide consultation hours where students can actually set appointments with us individually and they can consult with us. To be honest, no one has reached out to me. So sometimes you have to prod students too and just remind them that this is available, so that if there is a student who actually needs help, you'll be around for them. And finally, in terms of making community available, these are some strategies that we've tried out. Asking students to reply to each other in asynchronous discussion forums. That's one strategy that we've been doing a lot. And in synchronous sessions like this, for example, using tools like Zoom, we have them work in breakout sessions. And students like this because they get a chance to talk to each other as well. And in my graduate class, A lot of them expressed early on in the course that this is something that they miss in online learning. The opportunity not just to hear from the teacher and have conversations with the teacher, but also the opportunity to learn from their classmates and to actually hear and see their classmates. No? So synchronous sessions are great venues for things like that. So when we look at the five principles of adaptive design for learning, and maybe when we make a clearer connection with whole person education, I'd like to think that, and hopefully, as I was explaining, you did have a sense of this. Um, the foundation of all of these principles is really what is best for the student. The foundation of all of these principles is really to think about what is important to consider so that students will have equitable access to the content. Students will have a good learning experience, not just based on what the teacher knows, but based on the context of each particular student. So I'd like to end with a greeting. So we started with the greeting, and I'd like to end with a greeting that I think just reminds us of the big picture, of the key message, rather, that is behind everything that we actually do also in our work in Ateneo. I think that as we move into online learning, this term really encompasses what we really hope for. I don't know if you've encountered this term before. It's called sawubona. Sawubona is a greeting in Africa by the Zulu tribe, and when they meet each other, they greet each other with sawubona. And when we translate sawubona, it actually means we see you. The community sees you. I see you. And I think that when we talk about what we desire for online learning, hopefully this is our ultimate desire, uh, that students will feel like we see them, and students will feel like they see us as well, despite the limitations of distance, despite the limitations of the online learning environment. So thank you very much, and I hope that the presentation has helped you think about how online learning can be in your institutions.